Welcome to the Deep Dive. This is where we take complex theories, stack them up against the very latest technology, and really try to give you the essential knowledge you need fast. Today, we're doing something pretty ambitious, I think. We're building a bridge, really, between one of the absolute giants of military thought, Carl von Clausewitz, and the messy realities of 21st century warfare, specifically warfare increasingly shaped by artificial intelligence. Our mission today is to explore how Clausewitz's most famous idea, the concept of friction, holds up, or maybe fundamentally changes, in this age of algorithms. Now, if you've studied conflict theory at all, you'll know Clausewitzian friction is that gap, that immense gap between a neat plan on a map and the confusion, the exhaustion, the sheer unpredictability of actual warfighting. Historically, this friction was deeply human, wasn't it? A command's mistake, maybe a supply line getting bogged down in mud, or just a simple delay in communications across a dangerous battlefield. It's, the constant presence of chance, error, human failings, and wills clashing.
Exactly, and that's the launching point for the sources we're examining today. Their core argument is pretty stark, thinking that AI will somehow just eliminate friction. That's not just optimistic, it's actually dangerous. Friction doesn't just vanish with automation. Instead, it morphs. It changes into new forms, more systemic, maybe harder to see, potentially even more perilous forms that can trip you up before you even realize it. So our task in this deep dive is really to chart that transformation. We're going to try and pin down three key types of this new friction: informational, algorithmic, and organizational friction. And crucially, after identifying them, we want to pivot to the practical side. What policies, what leadership changes are needed to manage these new risks? How do we ensure that human judgment, that political purpose, stays firmly in the driver's seat no matter how fast the machines are going?
Right. So it sounds like we're shifting focus. We're moving from the old friction, which often came from scarcity, not having enough information, to a new kind of friction born from the exact opposite problem, saturation.
Yeah.
Too much data. Let's start there with that first transformation. Yeah, think about warfare historically. What was the commander's constant headache? Intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance, ISR. You were always fighting blind, essentially. Incomplete reports, delayed messages, maybe just missing pieces of the puzzle entirely, waiting days for a scout to return, hoping a vital ratio message actually got through. That was the classic friction of scarcity. But the analysis we're looking at says that whole picture has been turned on its head, completely inverted. Today's joint forces, they don't have a scarcity problem. They're drowning in data. We're talking an absolute flood. Petabytes coming in from countless ISR platforms, drones, satellites, you name it, plus cyber sensors, open source intelligence feeds, OSINT. The sheer volume, the velocity, it just overwhelms human capacity to process it, let alone make sense of it all. It's not a trickle, it's a fire hose.
And that sheer volume, that deluge, leads directly to what the sources call the paradox of abundance. You'd think, intuitively, more data means more clarity, right? More certainty. But in the heat of conflict, the opposite often happens. The saturation itself can actually increase uncertainty. It becomes harder to find the signal in the noise. Think about the operational reality. You might have thousands of data streams. Some might be correlated, accidentally reinforcing a false picture. Others could be actively contaminated by an adversary's disinformation campaign. How do you sort through that? And if your triage mechanisms, the automated filters meant to handle this flood, aren't up to scratch, or if they're poorly designed, well, then you risk forwarding bad data, low-quality data, right into your analytical models. So by the time information reaches a human commander, it might have passed through several layers of potentially flawed or even compromised processing. The commander's trust in the data's origin, its pedigree, starts to erode immediately.
So we're moving from the friction of ignorance, not knowing enough, to a friction of distrust. Being uncertain not because you lack data, but because you have too much data and you can't tell what's reliable.
That's a perfect way to put it. And this is the foundation for what the sources identify as the primary operational risk today: the immense pressure to choose speed over accuracy. They call it tempo over truth. Modern military thinking, especially around the OD loop, observe, orient, decide, act, puts a massive premium on speed. Getting inside the enemy's decision cycle, maintaining a high operational tempo, that's seen as a huge advantage. But here's the rub. If that decision cycle gets compressed faster than your systems can reliably validate the incoming data, commanders end up forced into making high-speed decisions based on higher-risk assumptions. Imagine you see what looks like a fleeting window of opportunity. The AI flagged a target with high confidence. The impulse, the pressure, is to act now. But if the underlying data hasn't been properly vetted, if its pedigree is questionable, that immediate action could be based on faulty intelligence. A tactical win could become a strategic blunder. This is still friction, classic Clausewitzian friction, the system breaking down under pressure, but the cause has shifted. It's now driven by too much data, and crucially, too little time to establish trust in that data.
For listeners working outside defense, maybe in finance or logistics, this probably sounds familiar. You face similar pressures when, say, your analytics team generates a big report based on scraped, unverified public data. The analysis is fast, sure, but if the inputs are flawed.
Right, the output can be toxic. That parallel is vital. And it's why existing military doctrine actually tries to get ahead of this. Joint Publication 6.0 on communications systems talks about this as a core challenge of communications discipline. It argues it's not just about deploying more sensors, it's about demanding aggressive prioritization and assurance of the data streams you do use. Commanders need to clearly define their critical information requirements. What do they absolutely need to know? And then the systems have to enforce strict quality control, ensuring the pedigree, the origin, timestamp, processing history of that specific data. Because if you can't assure the data pedigree, then frankly, any AI analysis built on top of it becomes suspect, especially in high-stakes situations. It forces the commander back towards slower, more traditional decision methods, undermining the whole point of having the AI in the first place. The friction hasn't gone away, it's just moved into the communication and validation process itself.
So the big lesson from this first section seems to be that in an age overflowing with information, the really scarce, valuable resource isn't data points. It's the signal-to-noise ratio. It's the validated integrity of what goes into the machine. And if the machine itself is supposed to be our filter, well, that brings us to the next logical question. What about the limitations of the machine? Okay, that's a really interesting setup. If the AI systems are meant to be the solution to this data overload, the things filtering the noise for us, then what are their own internal limitations? What are the ways the AI itself can introduce new kinds of friction? Unpredictable friction.
This is where we get into the concept of algorithmic friction. This isn't about external factors like weather or enemy action. This is friction generated from within the AI models, the code, the training data itself. It's a different kind of vulnerability stemming from the logic of the system. The sources highlight three major categories of internal failure modes that create this algorithmic friction. First, and this is a common one in machine learning, is training data bias. This happens when a model is trained and performs brilliantly in one specific environment, but then falters, sometimes badly, when it's deployed in a significantly different context. The friction here is the sudden, unexpected failure of a tool you were relying on for speed and accuracy.
Can you give us a concrete example? How does a technical issue like bias translate directly into, friction on the battlefield?
Sure. Let's imagine a sophisticated target recognition AI. It's been rigorously trained using data mostly from, say, desert environments in the American Southwest, parts of the Middle East. Think air terrain, clear visibility, certain types of buildings, vehicles. In simulations based on that data, it achieves, let's say, 99% accuracy. Looks great on paper. But now you deploy that same AI system to a conflict zone in perhaps Northern Europe. Suddenly it's dealing with dense forests, frequent rain or fog, maybe complex urban clutter. The visual cues it learned to rely on shadow patterns, thermal signatures, camouflage types, they're all different. Its accuracy plummets, maybe it drops to 60%, it starts generating false alarms, or worse, it fails to spot genuine threats hidden in the trees or cityscapes. That sudden gap, that disconnect between the expected performance based on training and the actual degraded performance in the real world, that is algorithmic friction. A commander who trusted that 99% figure is now getting unreliable, possibly dangerous recommendations right when they need clarity the most.
Right, that makes perfect sense. The context changed, and the tool wasn't ready for it. It's operating outside its design parameters.
Yeah.
What about the second issue you mentioned, distribution shift? How is that different?
Distribution shift is often a bit more subtle, and critically, it can be driven by policy changes, which makes it especially tricky in military operations. This occurs when the fundamental assumptions underlying the situation change. Perhaps the rules of engagement, the ROE, are updated, but the AI model doesn't or can't adapt quickly enough. For example, imagine an AI using reinforcement learning to optimize targeting in a relatively permissive environment. It learns a certain acceptable level of risk, maybe collateral damage risk, or risk to friendly forces to achieve maximum efficiency. But then the strategic context shifts dramatically. Maybe political leadership mandates a move to a zero collateral damage posture, or a highly sensitive peacekeeping operation begins. The ROE changed fundamentally. The AI's previously learned policy, which was optimized for efficiency under the old rules, is now potentially inappropriate, maybe even illegal or politically disastrous. It hasn't effectively transferred its learning to the new constraints. The friction here is that clash between the AI's rigid, learned behavior and the fluid, evolving human, political, or ethical reality.
And the third one sounds like it hits the commander's trust directly. Opacity, the whole black box problem.
Yes, opacity is a huge issue for command. Many of the most powerful AI models, particularly deep learning networks, are incredibly complex. So complex, in fact, that even their creators can't always fully explain why the model reaches a specific conclusion. They are, effectively, black boxes. For a commander trying to make a life or death decision, this is a major problem. If an AI recommends attacking target A instead of target B and says it's 95% confident, the commander instinctively needs to know why. Was target A prioritized because it's strategically more valuable, or was it just because the sensor data for target B happened to be slightly fuzzier? If the model's reasoning and its confidence levels are opaque, the commander can't reliably assess the risk. They can't easily predict how the model might fail. Is the AI confidently wrong because of hidden bias? Or is it nervously right, maybe seeing something subtle a human missed? This lack of explainability creates enormous friction both psychologically for the commander and operationally. It might force the human to override a potentially correct recommendation simply because they can't understand its basis, and that hesitation costs critical time.
So it's really clear how these aren't just, technical glitches for the engineers to fix later. They become real strategic problems.
Absolutely. That's the crux of it. An AI failure due to bias or distribution shift isn't just a bug. It can lead directly to wasting precious resources like expensive missiles on the wrong targets. Or, far more dangerously, it could lead to misinterpreting an adversary's actions during a crisis, potentially triggering an unintended escalation. The sources really emphasize this. Military resilience, especially with AI, has to be built on the assumption that components, including AI models, will degrade or fail under the stresses of war, whether that's enemy action, environmental changes, or deception. Trying to design for perfect, unbreakable AI performance is setting yourself up for failure when that inevitable friction occurs.
Okay, so we've looked at the friction from the data itself, only too much of it, and the friction from the algorithms, their internal flaws. Now, let's shift to the structure, how the military organizes itself to use these powerful AI tools. What's the big organizational danger zone here?
The biggest danger identified is what the sources call the centralization trap. There's this really powerful allure that comes with big data and AI, the idea that you can fuse everything, every sensor feed, every report from across the entire theater, all flowing into one central hub for instant processing. A single unified picture. That sounds great, right? This temptation to create a single all-knowing digital brain for command and control, or C2. Why is it so tempting? Well, proponents would say it promises this godlike view of the battlefield, perfect coordination of forces, maybe optimal resource allocation decided by a master algorithm. But this is exactly where Clausewitz, writing centuries ago, offers a chillingly relevant warning.
Because if you build that perfect centralized hub,
Yeah.
you've also just painted a giant bullseye on it.
Precisely. Clausewitz talked about the Schwerpunkt, the center of gravity. That critical element in an adversary system which, if you can hit it, causes their whole effort to collapse. If you concentrate all your critical C2 functions, all your data fusion, all your AI analysis into one single, massive, centralized hub, well, you've essentially just handed your enemy their primary target on a silver platter. This organizational choice, driven by the promise of AI efficiency, inadvertently creates a massive single point of failure, by design.
Let's drill down into those specific risks a bit, based on the C2 architectures the sources analyze. A fully centralized data fabric aims for that total awareness and speed. But what are the inescapable downsides in practice?
Well, the list is pretty sobering. First, as you said, the single point of failure risk is glaring. One successful attack, cyber or kinetic, could potentially decapitate the entire operation. Second, there's the issue of latency to the edge. Think about the soldier or marine on the front line who needs to make a split-second decision. In a highly centralized model, their sensor data might have to travel all the way back to the central hub, get processed, analyzed, and then the instructions have to travel all the way back out. By the time the decision reaches them, the situation might have changed. The targeting data could be stale. Then there's the fact that centralized systems create very predictable, very targetable traffic patterns. All that data converging on one point makes the communication links obvious targets for electronic warfare or jamming. And finally, these big central hubs often become huge bureaucratic bottlenecks. Every request, every piece of analysis has to funnel through the same point, creating delays.
Okay, and what about the more common approach, perhaps, the hierarchical hub-and-spoke model, where you have regional or functional hubs feeding a central one? That's not immune to problems either, is it?
No, not at all. While it tries to distribute things a bit more, it still runs into significant issues. You often get severe congestion at the choke nodes, the points where data is aggregated upwards. This can slow everything down. You can also get misaligned battle rhythms. The strategic headquarters might be operating on a different data processing cycle or have different priorities than the tactical units, leading to discoordination. And a really common frustration is the long classification chains. Data that's desperately needed at the tactical edge might get stuck moving slowly up and down the hierarchy because of security protocols designed to protect information at higher levels.
So given these risks of centralization, what's the doctrinal solution? How do militaries try to leverage AI without falling into this trap?
Well, the good news is the answer is already embedded in foundational doctrine, certainly in the U.S. context. Joint Publication 3.0 on operations heavily emphasizes the philosophy of mission command. Mission command is fundamentally built for a world of friction and uncertainty. It's about commanders stating their intent clearly, setting boundaries, and then delegating execution authority down to subordinate leaders. The idea is to empower those at the edge to exercise disciplined initiative, to adapt and act based on the local situation, especially when communications inevitably break down. So the key takeaway for the AI era is that we need to design our systems, our organizations, and our training for graceful degradation. You have to accept that parts of your network, parts of your C2 structure, will fail under pressure. The goal isn't to prevent failure entirely. That's probably impossible. The goal is to ensure the system can continue to function, perhaps at reduced capacity, but still function effectively when parts of it go dark.
That sounds like it connects directly to newer concepts like distributed lethality or mosaic warfare. Those ideas seem designed precisely to counter this centralization risk.
They are the logical endpoint of that thinking, yes. The DARPA concept of mosaic warfare, for instance, is predicated entirely on the assumption that friction and losses are inevitable in a peer conflict. In the mosaic model, resilience doesn't come from protecting one big, perfect, centralized system. It comes from the inherent flexibility to compose new kill chains on the fly, using whatever assets, sensors, shooters, C2 nodes happen to still be available after an attack. This demands high levels of interoperability, standardized interfaces, and what they call composability and substitutability. Any available sensor should be able to connect to any available shooter through any available decision node. It's about creating resilience through distributed, adaptable networks, which aligns perfectly with that mission command philosophy of trusting the edge to act on intent.
Okay, we've mapped these new types of friction, the data deluge, the flawed algorithms, the brittle organizations. So stepping back, what does all this really mean for the fundamental nature of war itself? Clausewitz gave us his famous remarkable Trinity, the interplay of passion, usually linked to the people, chance linked to the military forces, and reason linked to the government or policy. Does AI shatter that Trinity?
The sources strongly argue no, the Trinity endures. AI certainly impacts all three elements, doesn't it? It can inflame public passion through targeted information ops. It drastically accelerates the role of chance by speeding up combat. And it offers powerful new analytical tools to support political reason. So machines now mediate these forces in new ways. But the core principle, the absolute bedrock, that violence must always remain subordinate to political purpose, that doesn't change. The human element, the commander, the policymaker, the public remains the ultimate authority. The central policy challenge then becomes how to maintain that essential political control, that legitimacy, while still harnessing the speed and power AI offers. This leads directly to two absolutely critical policy mandates that the sources emphasize.
Okay, mandate number one sounds fundamental, positive control.
It's non-negotiable. Political leaders and military commanders must retain positive, affirmative control over any action that has irreversible consequences. And primarily, that means the release of lethal force. What does that look like practically? The sources are clear. It demands affirmative human authorization for any lethal strike. No fully autonomous kill decisions. And crucially, that human decision point needs to be captured in an immutable audit trail. Time-stamped logs showing who authorized what, when. If accountability for the use of force remains, quite rightly, with the human commander, then the system must provide undeniable proof of that human decision. The human is the final gatekeeper.
Right. And mandate number two seems designed to make sure that human gatekeepers isn't just hitting a button without understanding what's happening. That's algorithmic literacy.
Exactly. Algorithmic literacy is what makes positive control meaningful rather than just symbolic. If a commander is going to exercise effective oversight, they need a solid, functional understanding of the AI systems they're working with. Now, this isn't about expecting commanders to become expert coders, not at all. It's about developing critical thinking skills specifically related to AI outputs. What does that involve? The sources point to three key things. First, being able to ask the right questions about a model's training data. Where did it come from? What biases might be baked in? Under what conditions did it learn? Second, understanding how the model is calibrated. How does it express uncertainty? Can the human operator interpret those confidence scores reliably? Does a 95% confidence score mean the same thing for this model as it does for another? And third, perhaps most critically, developing the ability to recognize when an AI system is operating out of regime.
Out of regime, meaning the current situation is so different from the AI's training data that its predictions basically become unreliable guesswork.
That's precisely it. If the battlefield conditions change dramatically, maybe the enemy employs an unexpected tactic, or there's a sudden environmental shift like a chemical attack, something the model was never trained on. A commander literate in AI needs to recognize, okay, this situation is outside the model's valid operating parameters. Its recommendations are now highly suspect, and we need to rely much more heavily on human judgment. That literacy acts as a crucial firewall against catastrophic failures driven by algorithmic friction.
This leads to a really fascinating idea. The sources introduce the need to actually transform friction, not just fight it. They talk about harnessing constructive friction. That sounds paradoxical, especially when everyone's obsessed with speed.
It is deliberately paradoxical, and that's why it's so important and likely requires explicit policy enforcement. We need to distinguish between two types of friction. There's dysfunctional friction that's just pointless delay, opaque software, brittle networks, bureaucratic hurdles that waste time and add no value. We want to eliminate that. But constructive friction is different. This is about intentionally building pauses, checks, and validation steps into our processes, especially in automated kill chains. These aren't technical checks. They are mandatory moments for human judgment. You deliberately design in pauses for things like verifying data pedigree one last time, conducting a final proportionality assessment against the current rules of engagement, ensuring alignment with coalition partners, or getting final political sign-off for sensitive targets. The sources even suggest that the length of these mandatory pauses, the constructive friction, should be tied directly to the level of risk. Actions with potentially high collateral damage or strategic consequences would require a longer, more thorough human validation pause. It's about using friction strategically to ensure reason and policy stay in command of passion and chance.
That's a powerful idea. For our listeners, maybe in high-frequency trading or complex project management, it's akin to implementing a 4 eyes rule or a mandatory review period for really high-stakes decisions, even when the pressure is to move instantly. It's policy-enforcing deliberation. Clausewitz famously argued that moral forces, things like courage, leadership, the commander's will, are often more decisive than purely material factors. In this new era, with AI becoming a core part of the team, what's the equivalent? What's the new moral force commanders need to cultivate to navigate this transformed landscape of friction?
That's a great question. The sources suggest the crucial new element is calibrated trust and automation. This isn't blind faith in the machine, nor is it reflexive Luddism. It's trust that is earned, constantly evaluated, and placed appropriately. And that trust can only be built if the AI systems themselves are reliable, reasonably explainable, and operate under very clear lines of accountability. Building this calibrated trust requires cultivating really 3 key habits of mind in military leaders, primarily through professional military education, or PME. The first habit, as we've discussed, is literacy. Commanders need that functional understanding of AI capabilities and limitations. The second critical habit is fostering a culture of dissent. What does that mean? It means creating an environment where junior officers, NCOs, analysts feel not just permitted, but actively encouraged and rewarded for raising red flags when something seems off, even if it contradicts what the AI is saying. If the perfect algorithm recommends action X, but a human specialist sees an anomaly in the sensor feed or has a gut feeling based on experience, they must be empowered to challenge the machine without fear. That's how you counter automation bias and groupthink.
And the third habit sounds like the most fundamental: ownership.
Absolutely. Ownership must be indivisible and unambiguous. The moral and legal responsibility for every action taken, especially lethal actions, rests squarely with the human commander. Period. It doesn't shift to the algorithm. It doesn't shift to the defense contractor who built the AI. It doesn't shift to the data scientist. Internalizing this profound moral responsibility is what drives the need for rigorous positive control, for demanding explainability, and for building that trust calibration carefully. It underscored why the human must remain firmly in the loop.
So if these are the habits of mind we need, how do we actually instill them?
How does professional military education need to change to turn this theory into practice for the next generation of leaders?
PME needs a significant evolution, moving beyond just theoretical discussions of AI ethics. It needs hands-on, high-pressure training focused squarely on decision-making under conditions of algorithmic friction. The sources suggest three key learning outcomes. Outcome one is about teaching decision hygiene. This means putting students through relentless, time-constrained drills where they have to use structured analytic techniques specifically designed to challenge AI outputs. Can they spot potential bias? Can they rapidly seek out contradictory evidence, especially when communications are degraded and data is overwhelming? It's about training them to be critical consumers of AI recommendations, not just passive recipients. Outcome two is really about operationalizing mission command with AI teammates. Exercises need to force commanders to practice writing their intent not just for humans, but in formats that are also machine interpretable, maybe using clear, standardized schemas. And crucially, they need to practice authorizing actions using positive control interfaces under realistic stress, interrogating the AI's explainability features in real time to make informed trust judgments. How do you interact with the why from the machine when seconds count?
And the third outcome involves making AI management more routine, more integrated. Model governance as a formal staff function.
Precisely. This is about taking AI oversight out of the realm of specialized IT support and making it a core responsibility of the regular operational staff. Things like validating model performance, managing software configurations, reviewing incidents where AI failed or behaved unexpectedly, monitoring for drift. These need to be treated like established staff functions, just like managing logistics, intelligence, or fire support. This means having dedicated personnel, standardized checklists, clear reporting procedures, and established protocols for taking a potentially compromised or underperforming AI system offline and switching to backup methods. It institutionalizes the care and feeding of the machine teammate.
Okay, to pull all this together for everyone listening, the research we've covered culminates in 6 very specific actionable policy recommendations. These seem like the key takeaways for anyone working in defense, policy, or even high-stakes commercial analytics.
Yes, these 6 recommendations aim to provide a concrete roadmap for managing rather than trying to futilely eliminate these new forms of friction. Let me summarize them. First, engineer constructive friction. Deliberately build those verification pauses into automated processes, especially kill chains. Tie the length of the pause directly to the assessed risk, particularly collateral damage risk. Codify these pauses in doctrine. Second, mandate positive human control. Reiterate and enforce the requirement for affirmative human authorization for all lethal or irreversible effects. Back this up with immutable audit trails to ensure clear accountability. Third, debrittle C2 by design. Don't just assume networks will work. Actively resource, train for, and design systems that can function in degraded conditions. This means things like edge computing, data caching at the tactical level, and prioritizing critical command traffic over less essential data flows. Fourth, institutionalize algorithmic literacy. Make understanding AI principles, capabilities, limitations, and risks a required, examinable part of PME for all leaders. Perhaps mandate certification for commanders at battalion level and above. Fifth, adopt Mosaic principles for composability. Prioritize fielding systems that use open standards and standardized interfaces. Include clear data pedigree tags. This enables that dynamic recomposition of capabilities, true Mosaic warfare, when parts of the network fail. And sixth, update commanders' intent for machine consumption. Move towards creating intent statements that are not only clear to humans, but are also structured, perhaps schema-based, so they can be directly ingested and interpreted by AI systems, ensuring the machines operate within tightly defined constraints. #outro. So if we synthesize all of this, the core message is pretty clear. AI brings incredible speed, incredible reach, but friction. Friction absolutely persists. It just changes its shape. The goal, then, isn't this impossible dream of frictionless warfare. It's about finding a sophisticated balance. It's about learning how to shape friction using automation to accelerate where it's safe, reliable, and validated, but deliberately slowing down using constructive friction precisely where human moral, ethical, and political judgment is most needed.
And that tension, that fundamental trade-off between speed and judgment, it resonates far beyond the military, doesn't it? Whether you're making a fast-paced business decision based on analytics, or a medical diagnosis, or a tactical choice on the battlefield, that core human challenge remains. How do you act decisively, quickly, but also wisely and ethically? AI doesn't solve that dilemma for us. If anything, it sharpens it. It raises the stakes, and as we've discussed, it shifts where the critical points of friction actually occur.
And that intensity, that sharpening of the dilemma leads us to one final, maybe provocative thought to leave you with. building directly on this idea of constructive friction. If one side in a conflict successfully institutionalizes algorithmic literacy, builds systems with ethical pauses, and genuinely slows down key decisions to ensure proportionality and political alignment, what does that mean for the adversary? If an opponent knows you are deliberately introducing constructive friction for ethical reasons, does that give them a straightforward competitive advantage simply by acting faster? Or does the demonstrable commitment to moral constraint by one side create a different kind of advantage, perhaps strategic legitimacy or even a new vulnerability if that pause becomes predictable? That dynamic, the interplay between speed, ethics, and competitive advantage in the age of AI, that's really the strategic terrain we are only just beginning to explore.